I'm going to do all three chapters because I want us to get this broad picture of David and his unique relationship or alliance with Achish of Gath, the Philistine. After I sneeze. When I read the text and I see David leaving Israel, as we discussed a couple weeks ago, he did so because that's what God wanted to do, obviously, but also it was a matter of I can't stay here. I'm in the way of what God's doing. I'm not accomplishing anything for God's work here, and I need to move on. Like Jesus said in the New Testament, you go someplace, they don't receive you, you come to the dust from your feet, go to the next place. So David, I think, is doing that by leaving Israel and going to Gath. But I also believe that God is removing David so that God can complete his work with Saul. As long as David's on the scene, God can't finish his work in Saul's life. So God is pulling David out of Israel, out of the way, so God can do what he needs to do with Saul to bring Saul's life, ministry, kingdom to a conclusion. So we have chapter 27, David and his alliance with the Philistines. And let's read 27 through 28, verse 2. Then David said to himself, now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Saul then will despair of searching for me anymore in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. So David arose and crossed over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each with his household, even David with his two wives, and Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. Now it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country that I may live there, for why should I, your servant, live in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag that day, therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was a year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites and the Gizurites and the Amalekites, for they were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times, as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive. They took away the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, and the clothing. Then he returned and came to Achish. Now Achish said, where have you made a raid today? David said, against the Negev of Judah, and against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, and against the Negev of the Kenites. David did not leave a man or woman alive to bring to Gath, saying otherwise. They will tell about us, saying, so has David come and done so, has been in his practice all the time, and he has lived in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he has surely made himself an odious among his people, Israel, therefore he will become my servant forever. Now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camp for war to fight against Israel, and Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. David said to Achish, very well, you know what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. All right, a very unlikely alliance. David is known throughout all of Israel killing his thousands. David is known by the Philistines as the man who killed thousands of Philistines. David is known by the Philistines as a man who served Saul, was Saul's second in command. Why would Achish welcome David? Well, I think Achish knew there was an issue between David and Saul. He knew David had fled from Saul. So when David comes to Achish, Achish is not being dumb here. He's thinking, wow, what an asset for me as an enemy of Israel to have David in my camp, in my city, loyal to me, because all of David's knowledge will become Achish's knowledge if he goes to battle with Israel. That's great inside information for Achish against Israel and against Saul. So Achish is not wrong on his part to think this is a good idea, to bring David in and accept him and let him be among my people as my servant. David, however, sees an opportunity, one, to survive, But also for David, he knows he's been anointed as king, and one day he'll go back to Israel as king. Well, he's about to get a great view of the Philistines, their workings, Achish, his abilities, his army size, weapons. So when he is king of Israel again, he has good information about the Philistines, who he will fight against multiple times. So David sees it as an opportunity to survive for one, but also gather intelligence against the enemy of Israel, the Philistines. The text doesn't say all this. However, when you read the story, look at the context, they both have selfish motives for aligning themselves with each other. David provides Achish with the spoils of his raids, so Achish gets rich off of David, and then David gains favor with Achish, and Achish is trust. As David lives in Gath, he tells Achish, look, it's better for you to live someplace else where we wouldn't be a burden on you, someplace we can take care of our flocks, feed ourselves, etc., etc. He's given Ziklag, and David moves out of the city of Gath and takes the city of Ziklag, and that becomes his base. This makes sense because for David, his men may talk. If someone hears his men talking about raiding not Israelites, but possibly people who are allied with the Philistines against the Israelites, that would go poorly for them. So this unique alliance develops. David gets his own city outside of Gath in the wilderness where he can be safe and where he can do what he wants to do as far as serving against God. You have the raids that David does. Now he goes and he raids people who were not Israelites. And you think, well, this sounds kind of heartless of David. He goes to a city and kills every single human being. That's what a man of God. You think, how horrible is that? However, the people that David is going to and killing and destroying are the ones that God told Joshua to go to and utterly destroy when the Israelites first came into the land of promised land. David's continuing the work of Joshua, of the Israelites, when they came into the promised land to begin with, to cleanse it of all the unfaithful, all the sinners, all the pagans who rejected God for years and years and years. So their punishment was to be utterly destroyed. They earned what God gave them now through David. So David's raids are continuing the work of Joshua and what he came in and was doing when they entered the promised land. Of course, for David, he tells Achish, I'm killing Jews. Well, this causes me an issue. Because David's a bold-faced liar. That's all there is to it. He's a man of God who flat out lies to Achish, who he claims to be a loyal servant of. Well, you know, as a believer in Jesus Christ, as someone who is post-crucifixion, resurrection, day of Pentecost, God lives inside of me, I have a hard time believing God's directing me to go someplace and flat out lie to somebody. That just goes against my Christian beliefs as a believer with God in my heart. So how do we understand David being dishonest to Achish, misleading him the whole time he's with him, pretending to be loyal to Achish, but really is not being loyal to Achish? How do we justify that or understand that, maybe a better term? And I think if you read the whole Old Testament with the narratives and the stories, many times the Jews are dishonest to the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel. So there seems to be a pattern here of it's part of how God accomplishes his work through the Israelites. They are not bound by God to tell the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel, the truth, especially the ones they have been sent to destroy. So that kind of gives the context of David's dishonesty, makes it a little more easier for me to take as acceptable. Again, is this God's way or is it man's way to accomplish God's task? Being bound by relationship with God to tell enemies of God the truth. I mean, if I'm in a situation and I'm asked or pressed from a New Testament perspective, I'm inclined to say the truth when anything crosses my path, unlike David, who's lying to Achish. So it's hard for me to find justification. However, it's not the same. God pulled the Hebrews out to be his people, separate from the rest of the world, and there are unique situations from the very beginning, from Moses and the law all the way through Christ. that apply only to Hebrews. And how God works through them applies only to Hebrews. Even today, the Hebrews are still separated from the rest of the Gentile world, and they are set aside for Christ's return. When the church is raptured, the Jews remain, and they take the banner back, if you will, and represent God here on earth as God's people. So how God works through the Hebrews, how God works through the church is not always the same. There's some similarities, but there are some very dissimilar ways as well. And being post-resurrection, with the Holy Spirit living in my heart, our goal is not to destroy the enemies of God, as David's was. Our goal is to try and influence the enemies of God to come to a saving relationship with God. So it's not the same. We're comparing apples and oranges to say, I am to be a liar like David in that situation, but no, that's not the case. David's situation is that the Hebrew nation, God's work at that time against the enemies of God, enemies of Israel. God's work in my life is totally about representing Christ, being light, being salt. So my good works shine before men, so they see God in me and they come to God. That applies especially to the enemies of God, those who would hate God or deny God. So our goal as believers is to represent Christ even to those who hate Christ. In fact, I'd say even more so to those who hate Christ. If you think about it, I think the people that are most adamant about there is no God, there is no Jesus, are the ones who are being convicted the most by the Holy Spirit. So those that are most adamant about hating God are probably the ones who are most likely to receive a loving witness of a believer, because God's already dealing with them, so to be so adamant about their dislike for God. 28 verses 1 and 2. The war with the Israelites. Achish intends for David to fight beside him in this war. Now, again, the text doesn't say this, but based on the context of David's lying to Achish, there's no doubt in my mind when David goes to battle with the Philistines, in the middle of that battle, David and his men are going to turn and fight with Israel. And the way they lined up and went at each other, the goal was trying to break through that line and turn right or turn left and cause chaos with the lines to the right or the left, so they would break ranks and flee. Because when that happens, it's easy to wipe them out and win. So there's no doubt in my mind David's plan was to create havoc in the middle of that line, left or right, cause confusion in the Philistine army. They'd break ranks and they would run, and Israel's army could be very victorious in the battle. That was the goal. The text does not say that was David's intention. So I'll say it up front. I'm saying my understanding of the context is David is loyal to God, not Achish and Achish's God. David may have left Israel and claims loyalty to Achish, but no, he is still an Israelite, a child of God. He is not going to be an instrument of war against God's people. Again, the text doesn't say that, but I believe that is David's plan. Having said all that, note the purpose of this alliance from the beginning. David's call from God was to be king and defeat the enemies of Israel, God. David's call was not to convert the Philistines to Judaism, but to destroy them. So when we look at our call is not to destroy the lost, but to lead them to Jesus. So a huge difference there. In fact, if you look at history in America, I think part of the problem in America today is the American church tried to force the ungodly to act godly. Laws make sin against the law may sound all good, but in reality, that's trying to force a non-believer to live the life of a believer. That's impossible to do. I can't live the life of a believer without Christ in my heart. So the American church, in its mistakes, have tried to force people to live godly lives without Christ. And our total rejection of God in our country today is the backlash of that, I think. So we're not here to make people act like Christians. We're here to influence people to try and to see Christ and respond to Christ. So the idea of hating sinners is not part of what Jesus put us here to do, obviously. We're to love sinners, but acknowledging they are sinners. We don't ever overlook their sin or accept their sin as acceptable. We still call sin sin. That is not hating somebody. Don't misunderstand. I can call sin sin and still love the person who's a sinner, as Jesus plainly did when he walked on earth. It still does through his church today. So the purpose of the alliance for David was still to defeat Philistines, not to help them defeat God's army. The alliance, however, is not universal among the Philistines. David and Kish have teamed up, but the rest of the Philistines are not so happy with this idea. Chapter 29. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, while the Israelites camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. Then the commander of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commander of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years, and I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day?" But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be the heads of these men? Is this not David of whom they sang in the dances, saying, Saul slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out, and you're coming in with me, and the army are pleasing in my sight, for I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now therefore, return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." David said to Achish, "But what have I done, and what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish replied to David, "I know that you are pleasing in my sight like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said he must not go up with us to the battle. Now then arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have risen early in the morning and have light, depart." So David arose early in the morning, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. The rest of the Philistine army didn't care for David being there, and they probably were pretty wise to say that. They are not persuaded by David. They had not heard David speak and seen his spoils come in as though he had been attacking Israel to do this. Again, I think it was David's plan all along to fight for Israel in this battle and not for the Philistines. And I say that because of his dishonesty to Achish throughout their alliance. David was never honest with him, and I think that would have continued into this battle. However, some folks might go to verse 8 and say, "But David claims loyalty to Achish." He may have claimed it, but you didn't see it with the raids. So I have a hard time thinking David would have fought against Israel. Again, the text doesn't say that, but I think the context does point in that direction. David goes back to Ziklag. Again, I think in the situation here, it is God's intervention to remove David from the scene so that David cannot be an asset for Saul. It is God's intention to get David as far through the battle as possible so God can complete his work in Saul. Of course, the completed work in Saul is Saul's death of his sons. I think if David would have been there, David would have fought with Israel, and it would have changed the battle for a victory to Israel. So God is removing David for a reason, and that's so he can complete his task in Saul. So, to me, that's telling me I need to trust God with my circumstances. It may not make sense when God wants me here or wants me there. I may think, well, what are you doing, God? Why should I be over yonder? It makes no sense. It may be that God wants me in Maine, so I'm not here, so God can complete a work in your life without me getting in the way. Does that make sense? A lot of times I may think, why? But it's a matter of God's working in everybody's life. And everybody I know, God's working in their life. And it may be that God needs to be out of the way so he can work in their life. Like right now, my son Jonathan is in Orlando, University of Florida. I'm not there. Well, God has separated us. Maybe God needs me out of his life so God can accomplish his task in his life. Because if I'm there, well, I'm going to say something. I'm going to do something. I'll probably be in the way. Thankfully, he didn't have to go to California to get him out of the way, me out of the way. You know, it could have been a lot worse. Or maybe he's there, so he's out of my life, so God's working in my life. He had been in the way of God in my life. See, I don't know how that works, but it works. So whatever's going on in our life, our circumstances, I need to trust God that God's in control, and whatever's happening, God's allowing that, or he's actually causing that to happen in some cases for my good, for my son's good, if you will. God is doing what he needs to do to enable him to accomplish his work in our life. So I see that with David being sent out of there so that God can get him out of the way so he can accomplish his task for all of Israel and Saul. David leaves and goes back to Ziklag, chapter 30. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David goes back to Ziklag to find the city destroyed and everybody's family carried away with everything they own. They go back to Ziklag to find they have nothing, with the clothes on their back, which are clothes for war. You have to stop and think, why would God do this to David? What's the deal? David is God's man, a man for God's own heart. Why are these things happening to David? Why such catastrophe? Why such trauma? Why such horribleness? I mean, your whole family's been gone. Everything you own's been taken, but what taken was burned to the ground. Why is David in this situation? And I think there are three things happening here that God's accomplishing at one time through the Ziklag event. First, God is ensuring that David is nowhere close to being able to come to Israel and Saul's rescue. See, I'm thinking the battles lasted days sometimes. If David hears of the battle going against Israel, he and his men will run north to try and intervene to save Israel. Well, at this point, it doesn't matter what happens in Israel. David's only concern is his family to the south being led away captive. So I think the first thing happening here is God's making sure David is actually totally out of the way. Which communicates to me, listen to God. When he says, sit down and shut up, do so. Because he's doing his work in somebody's life, and he doesn't want me in the way. Again, Jonathan is in Orlando, and I'm thankful it's just 2 hours or so away, and not more. Hopefully that means that if something does happen to him or in his life, I don't go running down there. God trusts that I'll listen to him and know when to go, when to stay. If he should ever tell me, Jonathan, he needs help to begin with, which hopefully he doesn't. He takes care of himself. So the first thing is, I think God's ensuring David's out of the way so God can complete his work in Saul's life. The second thing happening at the same time is David's leadership received his greatest challenge. Verse 6. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. They were mad, and they saw it as David's fault, not theirs, and David's going to pay. So David is standing there with 600 men blaming him for the loss of their families, and they want revenge, and the revenge is, we're going to stone David, we're going to kill David. He has reason to be concerned here as a man, as an individual, as a leader. I like what David does as a leader. The end of verse 6. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. In the face of an army of 600 turning against you, wanting to stone you, David turns to God. He has reason to be in despair. He has reason to be hopeless. He does not take that route. He does not panic. He turns to God, and God strengthens him. And I'm thinking when those men see David turn to God, that stops them in their tracks as far as wanting to continue with stoning him or killing him. So David runs to God and is strengthened in God, which is a source of his strength anyway. As he writes in the Psalms over and over, God is his rock, and he experiences that here. And God intervened. People don't pursue stoning David. So the second part of the solution, first is he strengthens himself in God. The second part is he seeks to openly seek God's answer. Verse 7 and 8. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. This is not a private event. David, in front of all of his men, asked the priest to come and ask God out loud, what do you want me to do? And God answers him. Great leadership here. David lets the men, his people who follow him, know, look, I may be in charge, but ultimately God's in charge, and we're going to do what God wants us to do. So they receive assurance that you go find their family. They also receive assurance from God, you'll find and rescue everybody. Nothing will be lost. So second, David's leadership is challenged here, and he solves that challenge by seeking God's strength and publicly seeking God's intervention. Well, that's pretty awesome. David individually by himself seeks God. David publicly acknowledges to the world God is ultimately in charge, and that's who I'm following. The third thing happening here in chapter 30 is God reveals his power to all people through David's leadership. Verses 18 through 20. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. But nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. So David had captured all the sheep and the cattle which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, this is David's spoil. So David's victory communicates David's leadership. It also communicates the basis of David's leadership, and that's his personal relationship and trust in God. So Ziklag had 3 things going on, I think. Get David out of the way for Saul to be God's work completed in Saul's life. David's leadership is challenged and then affirmed. Again, when life throws the worst at you, don't panic, because God is God. He is sovereign. He is in all things and works all things for the good of those who love God. And that's you and me. So for David, what looked to be an awful situation became a massive, if you will, affirmation of his leadership ability and the fact that he was to be king of Israel. Because the next things that happen is Saul dies, and David moves back to Judah and becomes king. So God is doing all of this in Saul's life, in David's life, all at one time. God is sovereign. God is in control. So as we interact, we affirm each other. We get out of the way. God does his work in our lives, and we move on. Let's pray. And Father, we do thank you again for the opportunity we have to study your word, read your word. Thank you for speaking to us and encouraging us through the Bible, to who you are, Father, in your revelation to us. And I pray you will, as always, give us the opportunity to open our mouths and speak for you and share our love for you, those around us who don't know you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.